So good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's webinar. I would like to thank each participant for taking out precious time from their busy schedule to be here. As someone once said, finding happiness in yourself is by broadening your horizons and learning new things. The more you learn about the world around you, the more you learn about yourself. Exploration has been a buzzword over centuries, ranging from the early naval endeavors in the 15th century to the space missions of our days. Today, 500 explorers from different nations have ventured into space, motivated by curiosity, the desire for knowledge, and the confidence that space exploration could benefit mankind. The number of countries involved in space exploration is increasing rapidly, and the use of outer space is now truly global. Being India's first and the only MBA college, school declared as a mentor institute of the Government of India and the CII, NDIM is here with the prospect to discuss and open a new world of opportunities in the outer space. The endeavor is part of our leadership responsibility in education and knowledge enhancement. NDIM is a 28-year-old nationally and internationally accredited MBA school, declared Best Industry-Linked Business School of India 3 years in a row, 2017, 2018, and 2019 by AICTE, Ministry of HRD, and the CII. It's also declared best by the Associate Chambers of Commerce and Industry in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. Let me introduce the eminent speakers for today's webinar. Dr. Jane Leslie Smith. Dr. Smith is a professor of law at the Leuphana University, Lüneburg, admitted to practice in the United Kingdom and Germany. She is an expert in the field of outer space law and policy, procurement, and complex contracts. She is the Director, International Institute of Space Law, full member, International Academy of Astronautics, as well as Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. She has served the International Astronautical Federation, Paris, for a term of 5 years as General Counsel until 2019. Dr. Smith is also a member of the professional interest group Women in Aerospace Europe, where she served a term as board director and legal counsel.
Thank you.
Dr. Susan Gale Wintermuth. Dr. Wintermuth is a visiting professor at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga, the University of Central Asia, and in Germany. She holds a double bachelor's, a master's, and a Juris Doctorate degree. She practiced law for close to 20 years, developing a specialty in business law. Before retirement from being a practitioner, she dedicated her time to her family business, served on various boards, and continues to teach learners across the globe as a significant member of the academic world. Her specialty is business law and dispute resolution. Lastly, we have Mr. Rajiv Khaitan, Senior Partner, Khaitan and Company, LLP, advocates, leads the corporate and commercial law practice of Khaitan and Company at Bengaluru with over 30 years of experience in general legal practice with focus on business laws. He has advised on all aspects of the defense and aviation sectors on applicable laws and regulations, and also on space laws and related regulatory aspects in commercial contracts. He has also advised the Team Indus, one of the finalists in the Google Lunar Prize Challenge, to launch an indigenously developed and privately funded spacecraft and land a lunar rover on the moon on various applicable regulatory matters. I would like now to introduce our chairman, Dr. Vishwamohan Bansal. Dr. V.M. Bansal, Chairman, New Delhi Institute of Management, is a former civil servant and has been the youngest and the longest serving secretary, collector, commissioner, principal commissioner, and director of our country's biggest statutory urban authority, the Delhi Development Authority, commonly known as the DDA of the Government of India, for 28 years. He has headed several public sector undertakings and has been behind the success of the biggest national and international events, starting with Asiad 1982, Commonwealth Games 2010. He has been the special invitee and is the special invitee to the committees on higher education of both FICCI and CII, and the chairman of PHDCCI Committee on Education.
Thank you, Dr. Tripti. Thank you so very much. So I'll take only 2-3 minutes because, I would like all the participants to have real learning from all the great panelists over here. I must tell only one or two things is that the topic that we are going to analyze or discuss or understand today is perhaps first of its kind that is happening in the last 6 months or last 1 year at any of forums in India. Then why this topic? And why these great panelists with us? Being a person from management, being a person from education, and having been very keen to take new knowledge frontiers to every person interested in the academia, we set up a virtual research center with the support of Canada Research Center 2 years back. It looked very strange at that time that why we are setting up a space research center supported VR center at NDIM because we are a management college. But we need to think as to what exactly are the management challenges, initiatives and opportunities that are happening in the outer space. And we were very lucky to have 2 astronauts to come and inaugurate the research center. It was donated by them. So today's event is in continuation to that because we feel this COVID has, of course, upset the calculations or the thinkings of almost the entire world. Otherwise, all of you know that space was going to be the biggest opportunity in the coming days. Not that it has been impacted or affected. It continues to be the first priority for all purposes. But yes, our minds and our thinking right now is working only around the medicine or treatment of COVID. So that's what it is. So that is what the topic. And I must tell all the panelists that the participants today, they belong to, I just saw the list of the participants. They belong to almost every IIT of India, almost every Indian Institute of Management of the country, almost every corporate sector, starting from public sector units, even from Damodar Valley Corporation, and almost every educational institution is represented here. Of course, 25% to 30% are the students who are interested to understand what exactly lies in store for them in the space. So I'll not take more time. I'll request my friend and my colleague, Dr. Tripti. Dr. Tripti Desai is a senior professor at our college, New Delhi Institute of Management. And she teaches OB, and she's a professor of psychology also. That's her specialization. She teaches at Leuphana University, Germany, goes there on the request of the university to our college. And I'm happy to tell everybody that she's on the board of 4 Vodafone companies as a board director. So we feel really proud to having such faculty teaching at the college. This is what it is. Tripti, you can please take it forward, and other things we'll discuss later. Please carry on, and you take the proceedings on.
Right. Thank you, Chairman, Dr. Bansal. Once again, a very good evening to our audience and to the three of you, Dr. Smith, Dr. Wintermuth, and Mr. Kherna. To give you some structure of our webinar, the panelists will speak wearing their expertise hats. Dr. Smith will talk about space and space laws, a bit of its history, and that which the space lawyers call upstream space activities. Dr. Wintermuth will cover the areas of practical applications of space, some business models, and the sources of space-generated data, which can be used to develop business models. Mr. Khaitan will be of special interest to all of us. He will discuss specifically India's place in the space law orbit. And together, our very interesting cross-cultural panel will inform and discuss about space law and COVID-19 as an example of how space helps and addresses disasters. So I'll address Professor Smith first. Professor Smith speaks from Bremen, a state in Germany. Actually, it's one of the few city-states, and it's beautiful. Professor Smith is Scottish, married to a German, very senior lawyer. And actually, it was from Dr. Smith that I first heard that there was something called space law in my life 8 years ago. So, Dr. Smith, first and foremost, please tell us about this latest entrant in our lives, space and space law. Actually, what is space in this context?
Thank you, Dr. Desai. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Space is acknowledged by the fact that we really don't have any formal legal definition of what outer space is. So it is almost defined by exclusion. The astrophysicists look at outer space from what is called the von Karman line, a Hungarian astrophysicist who defined a certain altitude and said, as from that altitude, there will be the ability to undertake orbital activities, and up until that particular line, the von Karman line, then we are still in airspace. So this type of measurement has accompanied the development of law and is more or less distinguished by the fact that international law has not yet and will not define where outer space actually starts, because the physics of the activity and the technology define what outer space is. And quite a few states have therefore opted, in order to make clearer demarcations between the activities involved and the responsibilities of the states, they have therefore imported into domestic laws a barrier. And notably the newer space nations, the New Zealand, Australia, with national domestic space laws, they have defined what is outer space, what is airspace, simply to assist the demarcation between what is covered by aviation law and what is therefore covered by outer space law as it then developed. So we have this imaginary line about which there's still some discussion. So it's more or less, and depending on the technology, where you can have an orbital activity.
So as a follow-up, what is it that got you interested in space law?
So that is something very personal. And as life often is filled with coincidences, I happened to marry a German, come to relocate to Germany, and there is a large space industry here, where at one stage via my university activity, I was invited to contribute to qualification programs, professional training for space lawyers working locally. And thereafter, I was asked to, in fact, become involved in assisting organizing an enormous conference in Bremen on outer space, where I was more or less imported immediately into the community and then adopted by them. And since then, I have not been let out or let off. So I was picked up by the local space community, and they have adopted me, and I retain in this big family of space lawyers. So it's a great honor, a great honor.
Right, right. Dr. Wintermuth. Well, Dr. Wintermuth is American, who has chosen to make Germany her home and doesn't seem to be in a hurry to go back to her native country until the circumstances change. And we know what she means by what circumstances. She lives in Lüneburg, a beautiful town again, a town that even I've come to love. That's where Leuphana University is housed. And I've lived there for almost 3 years, and I go there in the summers, and it's always lovely to go there. Dr. Wintermuth, since you have specialized in business law and have been on various boards, what can you say about the business aspects of space law? Is it a business?
Thank you, Dr. Desai. Thank you, my colleagues. The short answer to that question is yes, but let me illustrate what I mean by yes. Most people think of space exploration as being a state activity, a government undertaking, probably mostly for defense and security reasons. But let me tell you the origin stories of what we all know of as GPS, Global Positioning System. Back in the early 50s, the US Navy was concerned because it was not always able to locate its submarines, particularly its ballistic submarines, with any precision when they were out in the open seas. About that time, Sputnik was launched. And the naval scientists were able to determine that they could track the exact orbit of Sputnik by following the Doppler effect. Now, the Doppler effect, we all know, it's that change in either sound or light that leaves a source and then arrives to us. Like the sound of a train being different when it's far away and when it approaches. So they reversed analyzed that, and they thought if we could put satellites up there and know their exact orbits, then our submarines could triangulate and tell us exactly where they are. And in fact, they did that. It proved to be true. And that's how we got our global positioning system. Then at some point, the government, and I really should give credit to the military, decided that the information should be public, and it's out there and it's free. And to this day, it's free. Now, let's talk about the business aspect. That started the ball rolling. And companies, for example, Garmin, figured out that they could take an application, put it into a little device, sell it to us to put on our dashboards, and we would have personal GPS. Well, as the technology developed, we now all get it on our smartphones, and that particular business model did not keep up with the technology. And so I doubt many of us have a Garmin or a TomTom anymore. We just put our smartphone up on the dash. But and I'm speaking mostly from the American point of view because that's what I'm most familiar with. In 2004, President Bush initiated the wind down of the manned space launches by the US. And then in 2015, the US passed a law specifically called Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Law. And steps such as this for the government to back out of taking information from space or going into space and ceding it to the private sectors resulted in what we all saw a couple of weeks ago with the launch of SpaceX. So it is becoming more and more a commercial activity, less and less a state activity. And we would probably all agree on this panel that right now we're probably at the same place that the internet was back in the 80s. We just don't even know what it can do for us. So yes, it's a business.
Okay, so just a quick question like I asked Dr. Smith. What got you interested in space and space law?
I'm a Trekkie.
Okay. Okay, so now we come to Mr. Khaitan, who is from our very own Bengaluru, a much better place currently than Delhi, both COVID-wise as well as weather-wise. Mr. Khaitan, where is India in all this? Does our country have a presence in space at all? And does India have laws governing space activity?
Thank you for inviting me and good evening, everybody. India space headquarters is actually Bangalore. And that is why in Bangalore, you have a lot of knowledge about space because you interact with companies dealing with space. India, where is it in the space? You wanted to ask that. So in ancient India and the ancient texts that you find in India, there is a reference to spacecraft travel from one planet to another. And there are descriptions of spacecrafts in texts such as Samaranga Sutra Dhara. And even there is a text called Vaimanika Shastra, and in Mahabharata and even in Ramayana, where Pushpak Viman and all that was there. But that was ancient. But soon after independence, India did start taking space very, very actively and very, very well. So India has been part of all space committees right from the very beginning. In 1957, they started off, and there was a Bombay space station that Vikram Sarabhai started at that time as a part of the Department of Atomic Energy, which later on became ISRO, which is based in Bangalore. And India has been part of all the treaties that the world community has signed under UN, what is called the Outer Space Treaty. India has ratified that and has been a party of that. Thereafter, India has also ratified what we call the Liability Convention, which decides who is liable for any damage caused by a spacecraft or a space object. Then India has also signed and is ratified another treaty, which is called the Registration Regulation. Now, what registration regulation is also a treaty which decides who is the owner of a particular space object and how do you register it. So India has signed that treaty also. The third and very important treaty in the world legal space law is how do you deal with astronauts who land in other countries and or other places, or objects that land in other places. So India has signed the treaty relating to return of space objects as well as astronauts. And then the fourth treaty is really, which is called the Moon Agreement. So although India has signed the Moon Agreement, but none of the developed countries or the spacefaring countries have actually ratified it. So India, right from the beginning, has been participating in the space program and the law around it, and has actively launched rockets, progressively. Now India has almost 50 satellites dealing with communications and remote sensing, as well as cartography and all that. So India is now one of the leading launchers or providers of launch services to the world at a very cheap cost. And to answer your question as to why my interest in space law, so basically communication in India in 92-93 started using satellites, and a lot of companies who deal with telecom wanted us to advise them on satellite-based transponders and licenses relating to that and issues relating to that. So this was around the 90s, 94, 93, 94, 95, when we first came across satellite related contracts for transponders and the radio frequencies that are licensed for telecom.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to Dr. Smith, a question, on the international scenario. Is space still predominantly a government undertaking? Is it a matter of national security? Or are there private parties also involved in this space?
Dr. Leslie, this is one of the most interesting and the challenging issues facing the entire community in the 21st century. As we've heard from the American developments, and in fact, a couple of weeks ago, end of May, with 2 astronauts being ferried to the International Space Station by a private company, SpaceX, we see there are commercial enterprises involved in space. There always have been commercial enterprises acting as government contractors, largely from this classic aerospace and defense background. But what we now also have in the 21st century is a totally new group of entrants into the commercial sector, and that is with the downstream applications on the one hand, plus the large number of large private commercial companies operating satellites. This does not mean that governmental activities are no longer out there, because governments still do require to manage geoinformation systems, to know the particularities of their own infrastructure. But it means that the governments are required to monitor and control what the commercial sector is doing. And this bridge between the main actors in international law in outer space are only the states. So the states, because international law is a field of law which covers only states, the individual national state must control what its commercial sector, private sector is doing. And this is in fact written into the Outer Space Treaty in Article 6, that the national governments must monitor and supervise. And so we have this requirement. And so the ball is in the park of the governments and the regulators to make sure that the commercial sector are doing what is required. And perhaps I'll just dip into what Mr. Kaitan was saying about registration, for example, of satellites. So it means if we have commercial satellites being launched, then the state in which that entity is based has the duty and obligation to register the satellite, because that is the international requirement and the state must fulfill that requirement. And this is where there is a little bit of a time lapse between the actual launching, the registration, and we do need some future mapping out and reminder to states to make sure they do in fact register their satellites and do not fail to do that, because technically that would mean the state is not conforming with its obligations. So this type of, just as governments are requiring car vehicle owners to have a license, and the car is licensed, so the space objects need a license. So it's a classic regulatory system, and the challenge for space law is to make sure that this domestic level of flow down or following through the obligations that the government has is in fact enforced. So therein lies the challenge. And with this new entrant group into the space sector, that is the interesting thing, because all of a sudden a new group which doesn't have a long legacy in industrial engineering is suddenly also present in this new space, as it's called, technology, and bridging the gap between the old and the new is what 21st century is about, and for domestic regulation as well.
So could any country do what it wants to do in space if it were capable?
That is a very open-ended question. Let us say, under the international law perspectives, there are international rules which impose obligations on the states, which they are required to adhere to. Outer space is to be used for peaceful purposes, and the treaties all contain large onerous duties of collaboration, cooperation, mutual respect, mutual information, so that there is a coherency and a coexistence of states in outer space, that there's this duty of mutual support. And we see it with the Rescue Convention, the duties to rescue astronauts if they land in another territory, and not the territory where they should have returned. So that is there, and the challenge for the future is to make sure that that concept of collaboration is retained, the spirit of cooperation is retained. And now back to your question, can states do something that's against law? Not all states have signed up to the treaties. We've heard there's a little bit of a divergence there. Nevertheless, the great majority of the members of the United Nations have signed up to the Outer Space Treaty. And even if they haven't signed up to that, there was a resolution of the General Assembly that predated the Outer Space Treaty, so that we can almost say, even if they're not party to the 1967 treaty, international law requires peaceful use, collaboration, and non-interference in other jurisdictional matters. And for example, I think at one stage people had asked, can you interfere with another state's satellite or another satellite, third-party property? Technically, it is not possible, because you need, as in all property issues and state issues, you would require the consent. So up until now, states have required their commercials, and the governments of themselves or military have only ever been dealing with their own satellites. And now the great challenge is how, given the crowded state of the outer space and crowded through debris, how can we even initiate a mechanism or a system for what is known in maritime law as salvage? Can I offer a commercial service of, I'm going to call it salvage because everybody knows what that means, bringing down these dysfunctional satellites? Can I offer that as a commercial service? And this is one of the challenges of new space law, is to make sure that the state obligations are transposed, and that systems for enabling this kind of cleanup action can be agreed to at international level. We do require agreement. So up until now, states have only interfered within their own registered satellites. Otherwise, it would be a breach of international law.
Okay, so Dr. Wintermuth, for you, I mean, can a state claim territory in space? I mean, when the USA planted the flag on the moon, was it claiming the moon as its territory?
The simple answer to that is no, but let me give both a legal answer and a practical answer. The Outer Space Treaty specifically states that states cannot claim sovereignty in outer space, but we know traditionally planting your flag was claiming property. So back when the moon landing occurred, the government, the US government was very careful to say, we come in peace for all mankind. And in fact, shortly after the moon landing, Congress passed a specific law that stated, and I quote, "This act," meaning planting the flag, "is not intended or is intended as a symbolic gesture of national pride and not to be construed as a declaration of national appropriation." However, let me move on and say a treaty, and by the way, that was compliant with the Outer Space Treaty, is simply a contract among states where they say that they will abide by what's in the treaty. As we know, the US is not shy about taking itself out of treaties that are inconvenient to it. Indeed, I would argue that it has removed itself from treaties that are convenient to it. So much of what we say is international law simply relies on the integrity of a state to observe it. But let me quickly tell you a very interesting story about the flag that was planted. You've all seen the pictures. It looks like it's flapping in the wind. There's no wind on the moon. And in fact, that led to some conspiracy theories about it all being staged. But if you read about it, the US knew that when it planted the flag, it was just going to drape there and hang like a wet dish towel. So they devised a curtain system where the pole has a rod going across. They slipped the flag across it just like you would a curtain. It even had some bends to make it look like it was flapping. And that's why we look like we have a flag flapping in the wind. The other interesting point about it is it's very short. And that's because spacesuits constrained the activity. And the astronauts could only reach so high. So as high as that flagpole is how high it is. But let me just close by making a practical remark, and that's the difference between the law and the reality on the ground. Look, we look at situations such as Crimea, which legally belonged to Ukraine. We look at a line of actual control that has disputes. We would hope that we all observe this international law, but it is going to require on cooperation and good graces. Right now, I'm not very comfortable with the Trump administration's willingness to be collegial, but there we are.
Okay, so let's take a step further and ask whether there are property rights in space. I mean, the world is somewhat, you mentioned Trump just now, the world is somewhat worried about Trump, who seems to be making noises in this direction. You're American, and I understand that Americans have passed a law stating that the citizens have a right to mine in outer space. What's all this about?
Yes, because the Outer Space Treaty says two important things: no claim of sovereignty, and that space is going to be used for the good of all mankind. That raises the question of, can you mine the resources? And if you remember that these treaties were written back in a time when we were only thinking about state actors, we weren't thinking about mining resources. The US and a couple other states also decided that they should take a step further, and the US passed a law that said US companies can explore and exploit outer space.
Oh.
By the way, US companies, not US citizens. Elon Musk is South African, okay? So come to the US and establish your company. And Luxembourg also passed a law recently, and it's even more explicit. In Article number 1, Luxembourg's law says outer space resources are capable of appropriation. So it's a contentious issue. We have one theory that says, no, whatever takes place in outer space has to be for the good of all. It has to be shared. The word equality is even used in the Outer Space Treaty. But the other argument is, who's going to do it if it's not the entities that are motivated by competitiveness and profit? I would also suggest to you that there is a trajectory that would allow the argument that if an entity can mine something, that the property it mines is then its own. You can analogize it to fishing. Once you land that fish in your boat, it's yours.
It's yours.
Moon rocks have been brought back, and nobody really disputed but what the US owned the moon rocks. It's not a settled issue. But the other point I want to make here too is, even if legally you could not own property in outer space.
Dr. Desai, may add one point to Dr. Wintermuth's comments on the mine resourcing very quickly. Dr. Desai, yes, very quickly. At the moment, there will be a continued discussion on this very issue of the extraction and the ownership. The issue being Moon Agreement, hardly any state parties, both colleagues have referred to that, but nevertheless, the Moon Agreement does say there should be a code. So the challenge for the international community is to agree on the background rules, as we have had in other parts of the world that have developed mining codes. The question is, can we agree on international consensus as to how this is going to take place? So that is another one of the discussions we're waiting to hear more about. But the USA, with its legislation, has provided has made the first step. Let's put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Khaitan, coming to you, let's turn to the issue of commercial contracts and commercial contracts and disputes in connection with space activity in India. You've dealt with some contracts relating to space activity here, right? Recognizing that you're confined with attorney-client confidentiality, can you nonetheless tell us something to help us understand issues that can arise in space activity related contracts?
Thank you. Surely. So basically, as Dr. Wintermuth as well as Dr. Smith have explained, that the outer space treaty is between states, and a state is bound by the obligations that it has contracted for, not only for activities that the state does on its own, but also of its subjects and citizens. And therefore, when a state has to allow any commercial exploitation of any space object or any space activity, it will need to enter into a contract with the commercial organization or business to ensure that it observes and fulfills the state's commitments to the world community. And therefore, such obligations with the business entity is contractual. It is for this reason that domestic law is passed to regulate that relationship between the state and its subjects like citizens and companies, to make it statutory binding in their own country's domestic law for observing those obligations which the state has bound itself under the international treaty. So for example, as I mentioned that there was a liability convention, And under that, the state is obliged for all damage or to compensate for all damage that its state, the space object which is launched out of its territory, to pay the state which has been hurt by that damage. And therefore, India has been thinking about making a space law bill, which was also published as a bill in 2017, but not yet passed. And therefore, till a statute is there, all those obligations are contractual. So therefore, if you want to launch a satellite from an Indian launch vehicle, you will need to enter into a contract or a launching contract with the commercial arm of ISRO, which is Antrix Corporation, or there's a new arm for domestic companies, which is called New Space India, there's NSI. So with that corporation, you have to contract for your obligations and liabilities that you will have in a contract for launching your spacecraft or a satellite. Now, the problems happen because the dates of launch are uncertain. Whether the launch will be successful or not is uncertain. And therefore, all the costs incurred by any commercial company in making the satellite and by ISRO for launching that vehicle will go to waste if the launch was not done properly and it was a failure. So that's where then insurance law comes into play. And insurance is used to, compensate some of the losses that you have to enter. So there were two types of disputes that is possible. One is a regulatory type of a dispute, that you negotiated for a transponder on a satellite which will be launched, say, 5 years later, and the launch never happened. Or before the launch happened, the regulations under which you thought you have entered into the license of that transponder has changed, or the government is saying that that regulation was not done properly. In fact, that was one of the disputes that was there, that India has been going through it, where the commercial arm of ISRO called Antrix Corporation had granted rights for a S-band transponder on a GSAT-6 to a company called Devas. Now, after 3 years, they said that that grant of that license was illegal, not properly done. And Devas took the government to court, even in the Hague, before the International Court. And those disputes are there and things like that. So one is a regulatory dispute, that the law under which you got a license or you thought you got a license is changed or is not, was not right. There was a mistake. You did not do things properly. The other one is your contractual obligation that you undertook while getting a launch agreement. You did not meet the conditions, or you didn't even understand what conditions meant when you took it, because you're a commercial organization, you have not done 10 launches and you don't know all of it. And therefore, you could have missed out on some important issue which you should have negotiated, which you did not. So launching a satellite through a launch vehicle involves several licensing through several government. You need an international telecom union license for your radio frequency for the launch and for tracking it later. If you wanted to launch a satellite through a non-Indian launch vehicle, then you needed a consent from the government. So a lot of these regulatory issues and contractual obligations, if you are unable to fulfill, or the launch date shifted and you could not meet your completion of your satellite by then, and you could not meet that date on which that launch happened. So all these result in disputes. And these are the issues one needs to worry about when you want to take a step in the space activity.
Thank you. Dr. Wintermuth, you mentioned to me earlier that many business models depend on space application. Can you elaborate on that?
Business models, that's probably even more interesting than dispute resolution. Let me divide it into 3 categories, and I'll address each. First, I want to give some examples of business application of space. 2, I want to talk in general terms about business models for your management students. And number 3, I want to talk about financing, and I'll ask the other panel members to add to that. The 2 examples I want to give you with regard to business application span the spectrum. The first one is about a Canadian chap by the name of Wade Barnes. He's a son of a farmer, grew up on the farm, went to university to study precision farming, they called it. And one day he's going through the Landsat information. Something we'll talk about briefly is the immense amount of free information on the internet that comes from all these satellites, Landsat. That's land observation by satellites. It is by the US government, specifically the United States Geological Survey. Both of my son-in-laws work for it. It puts its information free up there. So Mr. Barnes is going through that and looking at images, and he realizes that he can determine how much nitrogen needs to be added to fields to improve the yield, and which fields do not need so much nitrogen. Up until that point, farmers would go out and spread nitrogen evenly across all of their fields, not paying attention to the analysis. So from that, he tried it on his own. He rigged his tractor using GPS now to distribute the nitrogen according to what his remote sensing information had shown him, and it worked. So from there, he developed his business, and the point I want to make here is he developed it based on data already available. Okay? He had an idea, he knew his market, and he did the analysis. Now, the other example I want to give you is at the opposite end of the spectrum, and that's a gentleman by the name of Daniel Faber. I believe he's even an Australian who has also moved to Silicon Valley. He describes himself as a serial entrepreneur. He is a scientist and is into mining. So he has developed a series of business geared towards asteroid mining. There's a wonderful interview of him that's online that I would encourage everyone to go watch. But he says, look, asteroids are easier to mine than the moon because the gravity is less. That if you say it's $5 to $10 million per ton just to boost a rocket into low Earth orbit, half of that is fuel, and it's due to the gravity. I want to go mine asteroids, not for minerals, for water. I'll take that water on the asteroid and I will divide it into the oxygen and the hydrogen. I'll use the hydrogen for energy, or I'll figure out solar energy. He ultimately wants to place fueling stations in space so that as rockets move further and further out, they have to be fueled somehow. He's going to be there. He took his idea from the gold rush here in the West. The people that got rich were not those mining for gold. The people that got rich were the trading stations that were set up along the way to supply these miners. And he started one business which worked on the technology. He started another business that worked on the engines. He is now, in fact, engaged in a business to go out and try to drum up the market. But by him, I want to illustrate how you can also be forward thinking as to what's available with regard to space. Now, business models. I can only speak in general terms here since every business is different. But if you have an idea, the first step is to figure out the feasibility of the idea, okay? And part of the feasibility, at least for Mr. Faber, was saying, look, I'm going to start my mining operations with robotics to prove it can be done. And then I'm going to establish settlements. Anyway, he has a very step-by-step progression on it. So you have your idea, you figure out the feasibility, you know your market, and basically you need a business plan, a very elaborate one. Now, where do you get the money for it? If you're lucky, the US government gives you millions and millions of dollars like it did SpaceX and like it did Jeff Bezos. But of course it wasn't based on nothing. It was based on their business plans. Also, Elon Musk had a lot of his own resources. I think he made his money off of PayPal, if I remember correctly. So financing, you've got your own money for the startup, or you go to mom and dad, okay? You can get loans, which is debt, or you can have investors, which is equity, but then both of those require that your business model be in place. With that, I'd like to ask both Dr. Smith and Mr. Kaitan, please contribute to this question of a business model for space activities.
Development that will be of interest to everybody, particularly India. There is an international convention has been passed with a particular protocol to allow the creation of a register of mortgages, so that in fact investors that are investing into satellite businesses can secure their loans via this protocol. I'm not quite sure about the number of ratifications. Berlin was the hosting signatory state, but they are hoping, investors are hoping that this mechanism of having secured registered rights will assist the funding for the new industries. The classical industries don't need security loans. They have contractual arrangements with their banks, as Mr. Kaitan will know.
How expensive is it? How expensive is it to work with space? And I mean, it sounds as if there's just a lot of money that one has to invest, and you have to be, you know, super rich to think about working with space and space-related activities.
So,
Is that true?
Is this Mr. Kaitan?
carry on, Doctor.
Yes. I think there's two levels of discussion here. There are classic cases of particularly the community of nanosatellites, where young individual entrepreneurs working out of universities have in fact been able, on low budgets, been able to develop their businesses, and at the certain stage of development then they have attracted external funding. But that is not the same dimension of corporate business as is traditionally known in the space world, which has access to totally different funding, also because the stakeholders are enormous classical institutions.
Mr. Kaitan, what is India doing? I mean, are we using a lot of applications, and you know, where are we in this?
So India uses satellite and space technology substantially. Earlier, it started with the telecom use of satellites and for broadcasting television signals. and a lot of Indian companies have now started using satellite broadcasted signals for the television industry that we have. Cable television industry has grown based on a satellite model only, because most of the broadcast happens through satellite downlinking and uplinking from India as well. So that's a very large portion of the it's commercial use of space technology, where a lot of Indian companies, now there are at least 100 broadcasters which have satellite channels. So that's one area of commercial area. The other area which is very much in use is using satellite communication for various other uses. One very important use which is being undertaken in India commercially is medicine, telemedicine. Remote villages are connected through satellite communication, and smaller diagnostic centers and smaller rural hospitals connect with a parent hospital where more, the more specialist doctors are available and who assist this rural hospital in doing diagnostics. Telemedicine is even used for not only diagnostic, but even for overseeing heart operations. So a local surgeon does it, but a specialist is overlooking through telemedicine and advising the local doctor. And at times it is possible to use robotics in these as well. So medicine is a substantial use in that area. If you look at telecom, that's yet another area. The amount of satellite usage for flood forecasting and water shed management India is doing in using their remote sensing satellite and the remote sensing policy that India has is not funny. There is a site on the ISRO website called Dhruva. It's public. All the data available over there is public. You can go on to the Dhruva site. The amount of information that you can get over there, the type of data that you have already over there is mind-boggling, to say the least. You can do geo-tagging of all assets in your factory, and you can take a license for using the satellite for tagging your assets. So large factories, large transport organizations having number of vehicles, large fleets of vehicles can be tagged and tracked through a satellite in India and available already in the Dhruva website. ISRO grants licenses for such activity. You can actually tag the birds that you saw recently in any forest. There is tagging for forest. The Karnataka Forest Department helps in this Dhruva site and details all the forest information that is available. Where a sighting has happened of an animal or a bird is all available on that site today. It's a beautiful site. Not many people know about that because it's not published too widely. But if you just go onto this site, there's a wealth of data already available free. Yes, if you want data which is more specific and with this, the magnification of more than 1 meter, you need a license, and the government also regulates certain data in certain areas from a sensitivity point of view, from a defense and security of the country. But the humongous amount of work is happening in, for example, river stream management, downstream management, cleaning of Ganga is regulated. We will go for COVID, but they are using for disaster management. Now, every boat that goes out on the sea is now having a beacon. Now, during disaster, the disaster services can track every fisherman that is gone onto the sea, and they can track. The recent Amphan cyclone that came and tormented West Bengal. If you go, you can see on this Dhruva site how this satellite imagery was used to identify the path of that cyclone and to provide help in those areas where flooding has happened, and to provide help in those areas. It has been used online, actually in cutting edge technology has been used to provide help in this country. Now you don't need to go about in a helicopter finding out what has happened. You can see it on the satellite, except that the publicly available data is dated. But the government and the licensed people have absolutely current data, which you can see. So the data is used for maritime, for identifying minerals, for weather forecasting. The satellites India has launched for Inmarsat, the weather forecasting is done based on that. It is also used in India for agriculture. For every site where Narega work is happening, each asset is tagged on an in our Dhruva or a ISRO database. So wherever work is going on, it's being tracked and tagged. So there is a online, absolutely cutting edge data available to the government to identify where work is going on, what is happening where. They have absolutely latest data available with them. So I can just go on and on. It's so many things that they are using for doing various. Now all the tea gardens, are tagged. Where what is the boundary of a tea garden, coffee plantations, rubber plantations, weather over there. All that data is being compiled by our government. It's just that it's not being publicized.
So before we go on to our last section, when we are talking about COVID and space-related laws, as well as how space has helped it, I just want to quickly kind of go back a little, Dr. Smith, and just want to ask you, who owns the space over a country? Or put it in another way, I know that we can shoot down planes over the airspace, but can we shoot down satellites?
Outer space is that which is beyond the von Karman line. National airspace will presumably be defined in various national statutes, but is also defined in international aviation conventions which allow cross-border traffic of air flight. Interference there is no territorial claim over outer space, and interference with one's own space objects as a state is something which is permissible, but interference with third states, space objects, is not permissible. And anything that is otherwise collaborative. So shooting is something, the subject of shooting aircraft over one's own national territory is a sensitive issue. But in outer space, we are looking at peaceful use of outer space, civilian use of outer space, even though we've had generations of military satellites gathering all sorts of information, the spy in the sky. The most interesting thing is that the quality of the civilian satellites, and notably the satellites with high resolution, is such that they are delivering fantastic high resolution data, which the military is able to use to carry out its mapping and tracking. So the activities in outer space they prohibit interference in another party's property, satellite property, over which the state has jurisdiction. And that's how, so there's no territorial claims, no property claims, but over this concept of jurisdiction, that the satellite remains with its DNA of the state it has been registered by. Of course, now we are having, perhaps in this, issues with deflection or potential collisions of satellites. And this is something that is concerning the international community and falls under what is now called the attempts to introduce a form of space traffic management. Which are the rules of the road? How do we encourage the debris that is dysfunctional? How can we get rid of it? And what happens if debris crashes into my satellite? But in fact, this is already happening a lot. This is happening a lot, and the satellite imagery shows you that the satellites have got, hits where they've been hit by bits of debris. And on occasion, of course, debris can lead to dysfunction of a satellite if it's serious. So this is being looked at in the private commercial sector. The operators are doing a form of sharing data. They are sharing their data. The agencies already notify one another, and they say, there is a risk course, and the satellite operators will then slightly readjust the path of their satellite so that there is no collision. So a lot of nano management is taking place up there by the ground stations, and this comes back to this international coordination and control. But with the increase in debris, managing the entire orbital traffic is a great task ahead of us. And the regulatory community, the international community, is looking to discuss how can we manage that, because we have it on Earth, road traffic management, and now we need it in outer space. We have it for the skies as well, but we now need it for transcending both vertically access to orbit, and then once we're in orbit. And so that is one of the challenges for the 21st century, is to find a system of non-interference with third-party state property that's justified. But we have recently the European Space Agency had a collision course, and they did ask for assistance. In fact, I think SpaceX was asked to assist the European Space Agency, and there are reports on that are very much worthwhile looking into. I have been told by astrophysicists it's very difficult actually to pinpoint exactly where space objects are, so that in fact the suspected impact might not be exactly what you predict. And in this little ESA, European Space Agency, call for help, SpaceX said, but this dangerous debris or vehicle is actually not where you think it is. So one of the greatest challenges is going to be finding out exactly where these objects are.
Okay, so I've had to cut out a lot of the questions because we're already kind of running late, or rather we've not been able to cover as much as we thought we could. But we will come to this very important thing that has taken over our lives just now, and that's the pandemic, the COVID-19. How does this activity, the applications for disaster management, for any of these kind of issues, are they being used? I mean, is space, are any of these kind of related aspects, have they been used for handling COVID? And I believe you, Dr. Smith, have also published something in this area. So of course, everybody would please contribute here, but you can start it off, and I would also urge you all to be a little short and quick, because we are kind of, the audience might be getting a little restless, but this is something really important, and I'd like for you to, all of you, to give your inputs.
Thank you. I will do my very best. The international space rules which we have there and charters allow data sharing to manage crisis. Mr. Kaitan has referred to that. So we have various open data systems where agencies, UN and other help communities they send them the data. From the data, you know what's going on. We have had this before in pandemics. The last pandemic, particularly in the African continent with Ebola, is something equivalent, where the communities could be mapped. And of course, there's a level of tracking as possible, where if the individuals themselves are given appropriate equipment, then there can be actual personal tracking. The COVID response by space has been proactive. First of all, the space industry and the agencies have, through their high technology, been able to supply and provide infrastructure support, hardware and software, whether 3D printing, other forms of I'm going to call it tubing, piping. So they have been able to deliver to the community, and there have been extra, I'm not going to call them experiments actually, but delivery of usables for the health services to manage the control of the people and the delivery of supplies. Let's say drones, these kind of vehicles could be used. At the same time, because of the robustness of COVID, there was a certain scare that in fact, the ground control operators would have to be thinned out on the ground if there were issues of cross-contamination. But that has all actually been dealt with very, very strategically by those on the ground, because the satellites are still required to be operated. That's been done exceptionally well. So you will find on each of the space agencies' dashboards, their update on what they've actually done in outreach. The Italian government in Europe started, the Italian Space Agency, the European Space Agency, the UK has been relatively badly hit, and the European Space Agency gave the UK funding actually to develop equipment to supply. So on the ground, that's taken place. We shouldn't forget that the great advantage of the International Space Station, there is a legacy of testing for vaccines. And last year there was an Ebola vaccine was being tested out on the space station. So in fact, this resilience and robustness of outer space is there to provide the information, and that's where we are going in the 21st century. As Mr. Kaitan said, it's about where is the information, how can we access, and what do we see? What does the data show, and where is the spread of the pandemic? They're doing the same actually with extinction of animals in certain parts of the world. They've equipped the animals with sensors to follow through where are these animals going and where are they actually dying. So it's being done for mankind and the animal world. And perhaps I could finish just by saying that both the UN and the OECD, they have got very serious sustainability goals, which include health, the health of the populations. So via the space as and a sustainable goal, space is seen as a key technology and a provider of the information to help for the benefit of improving our health and managing disease, so disease management.
Mr. Khaitan, how much has India used, space technology for COVID? I mean,
Yeah, so
our health and well-being, how much is it being used?
yeah, so India is using this space technology substantially. If you look at the Ministry of Health data that is coming out on televisions on a daily basis, actually on the Dhruva site, which is hosted by ISRO, all the data is available real time for each state. And if you want to know where all the hospitals, COVID hospitals treating them are, you can get that. Where are testing facilities available, you can get that on their website. So it's like ease of collecting data from various sources and to upload that from all the various places. So basically they are getting data from all over the country using their VSAT network that they have. Even in each village may not have that, but each cluster of villages do have that already. And information is flowing from there into using satellite technology and is available on a dashboard that ISRO hosts in the name of Dhruva. If you go on the Dhruva site, you can get to know latest data, how many patients have actually become well, how many are still in a treatment, which part of the country they are, all that data is available. Now, certain states, 3 states have used the satellite technology for collecting data for their states for fighting COVID. Telangana, Bihar, and I think one more country, I think Tamil Nadu. So their apps that they use for treating and dealing with this COVID situation is all run through the satellite network. So they are using that network for the satellite-based network for running their apps on the ground and for collecting data. And whenever you quarantine an individual, they are tracking quarantining using GPS data using the satellite. So that's also helping them in tracking compliance with the quarantine. And therefore, the government is actually using a lot of space resources for dealing with the COVID situation. In fact, they have this way, ISRO along with the Electronics Corporation of India has created something called Monal 2020 technology, which is for round the clock monitoring of home isolation of COVID patients.
Wow.
Wherever they set up an isolation center, they track it using satellite technology all over the country. So they have used it quite usefully.
Lastly, Dr. Wintermuth, how is the US been using space technology for handling, because US itself was on fire at one time. How is it been using?
The answer is simply not well. Not well. There was no leadership that allowed a coordinated effort. The states were left on their own. And I think Mr. Kaitan's description of what was done in India would be a good model that hopefully we could get the world to adopt, so that information was shared across borders. And had that been done, we could have seen where COVID was moving, but we didn't. So hopefully we learn.
Okay, so, well, of course, as usual, we are running out of time, and the topic is like the name itself. It's about space and it's endless, so we could go on forever. But
we have some good questions.
Pardon?
We have some good questions with regard
Right.
to business management.
So what I'm going to do is, if any of you would like to make a kind of a closing remark, a one-line, two-line of something that is of kind of importance or probably might get covered in the questions, maybe I'll just hand over the platform to our host and chairman, Dr. Bansal, and he'll take it over from here.
No, thank you so much. It has been big learning for me, and I'm sure every participant here had a lot of learning taking back home. And now I request the anchors to please come up with some questions, which they feel because of, so that we can wind up those things in 10 to 15 minutes.
One reoccurring question has been, what are the management opportunities for students studying management? And another good question that repeated was, can you specialize in space management? So perhaps Mr. Kaitan would like to address the question about management opportunities.
So in the space technology, there are several aspects of it actually from a commercial perspective. You can assist in the manufacture of the space vehicles, satellites, or the spacecraft itself, learn the processes and regulations that are required for launching a vehicle, because most commercial organizations who will want to use a satellite will need to take a license for the particular area or the transponder or for the maps that are available online. And the management students will be well advised to understand the various regulations that allow you to take a license, who to go to for what license, what contract to sign, what are the areas that you need to be careful of. For example, the entire land records are slowly being tagged into satellite-based cartographic maps. So even delineating boundaries of properties is covered by a satellite technology. So the various governments are doing pilots of using satellite maps for identifying various boundaries of various lands parcels that are there, and tagging the current municipal khatas, as we call it, into the space maps available for the country. So mapping, so if you learn and if you take courses of cartography, that gives a good scope. Licensing, regulatory, contract management, all of these areas require a lot of management skills. Even the telemedicine area has a vast opportunity for management graduates for setting up entities which can create a large number of these entities in small, rural, urban areas, and connect with the rural areas to provide these services. So this is the type of businesses. There's so much business opportunity using the data that is available and providing for the needs of the population. So it's a adjunct knowledge about this with your regular specialization is what is required. So knowledge of space law will help you manage your businesses by using space available or space technology available or space objects which are available for your licensing.
But very quickly, there is an international space university which has contributions from many space agencies and from industry, which offer various programs, summer programs, MBAs. Some of the law faculties in India do offer space law courses, but I think from a management perspective, something like the ISU model is quite unique because it's been set up exclusively for people interested.
Yes, India also has a Space Technology Institute, Technology in Trivandrum, which is having all these courses, which is also in space technology. So there are 2 or 3 areas in space. One is an engineering area where you learn the technology for launching a vehicle and for making a rocket and for all that aspect. The other area is managing businesses which will use the data available from satellites like maps, mining. It is all encompassing. Wherever you can use what is called a large number of networked operations with a control at one place with a large number of data flowing will need management resources.
So we have a lot of questions. One very interesting question from Ms. Bhumika Bansal is, how can we buy a piece of land on moon?
Perhaps I can answer that and say, this is a very entertaining question, but legally it is not possible. However, there are various individuals around this world who have set up websites and who are selling little parchments and certificates for buying little plots on the moon. But depending on which jurisdiction they are actually seated in, the authorities may or may not take this as a serious fraud. It exists as well. In fact, it exists in my own jurisdiction, where some people think you can buy little plots of Scottish land and become a Scottish lord just by buying a rock for £100. Basically, it is fraud, and depending on the jurisdiction where the individual is busy or offering the purchase, it will or will not stay. But I do know some space scientists who have decided, because they thought it was just such a fantastic idea, so they could have a certificate on their wall saying that they owned a little bit of the moon. They've spent their $100 just to have the parchment, but you mustn't take it seriously.
All right. So we have one more question from Mr. Lalit Mandal. He says, is there any conflict as well as common space between countries is concerned?
So the issue remains there is no territorial claim in outer space. It is open for all countries, for all states to participate in, and it's open for all countries to come together and collaborate. One of the questions was about what governs the International Space Station. Who's involved? That is a perfect example of how various countries have got together and established an international governmental agreement on how to manage the ISS. And this agreement will actually lead the way for the next agreement on the next platform and halfway house out to Mars, the cislunar gateway. So these international collaborative mechanisms and accords are the way to do it. But there is no territorial claim in outer space, not at all.
Yes, so the outer space belongs to the mankind, human mankind. It belongs to nobody. In fact, that's what the Outer Space Treaty actually says, that all celestial objects are for the mankind. It belongs to nobody. And for the peaceful use of and benefit for the whole mankind.
Yeah.
Let me just add a word of caution, and that is the U.S. is proposing something it calls the Artemis Accords. and it has looked at the Outer Space Treaty. It has found some loopholes in it. And in this proposed, they call it accords. I think they're wanting to make it a treaty. It reads very, very nicely about transparency, cooperation, debris, but it has a provision in there that it calls safety zones, meaning if there is an establishment set up in outer space, presumably the moon or an asteroid, that there should be the ability to have a safety zone around it for non-interference. I would suggest that that in fact violates the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty. It is in fact a claim of sovereignty, but what are the remedies? If the US is the first there to do it and does it and is able to prevent others from interfering, we have a problem. So there's the real life aspect to all of this, despite all the highfalutin language that we find in these treaties. And would any of you trust Trump not to do it?
So with the Artemis treaties, there are a lot of discussions going on. Obviously, navigation and landing in outer space, be it the moon or elsewhere, is a particular precision, high precision activity. And therefore there is of course a requirement that you do not dock or land too close to something which is already there. I think Trump, part of his background is the aspects all states have territorial waters in which they can claim as their own. So the area of security is a sort of application of this territorial water jurisdiction. And there will be great discussions on whether or not the international community is happy to go along that way. Having said that, it of course does mean the technology requires you to keep a safe distance away from the other technology that's out there.
So Dr. Winterthur mentioned about this, but the treaty also has certain provisions which allow America to take that view, except that what needs to be done is to read the whole treaty and take it as a whole and the cooperation angle about it. But they are picking up one provision in that treaty which says that if you have already an object on the moon or any other celestial object, any other person must not interfere with that. And if they do, they will be bound to pay damages to the state which owned the first object, unless they were the other object, the country state having the other object was in default. So they have very meticulously gone through the treaty and found this little piece that if you have gone to a place first, then nobody can disturb you around that, and they have to land at a safe distance away from you.
I think that's a subject, if I may say, Dr. Desai, for our next webinar, because it is, it is amongst all the other challenges which we have. That is the next big one.
Any other questions?
How to deal with debris.
I see a question about the Do for a Space
I think we've covered a lot of questions. Mr. Atanu Mandal, he's from West Bengal. He's the Deputy Manager, Chemistry, Media, Thermal Power. He's really thankful for this webinar. He's saying that we had a lot of insights. Thank you so much for this. We don't have much questions. I think we've covered almost all. So Dr. Tripti, I think you can take it over now.
So in fact, as Tripti had asked in the beginning, that maybe there's one final remark that all the three panelists would like to make. So thereafter, or rather I'll extend my sincere thanks to all the participants, first of all. More than 200 of them or 250 of them have stayed throughout the session. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it has been a very different kind of a participant from all walks of life, from all parts of the country, some from overseas. Some of the questions that were asked were from our friends in USA. So I must say that we've got something very useful out of it. and also the question that what management practices or management streams can open out of this. Possibly that throws a big kind of a new challenge to us, a new, I say, initiative that we should be getting into, so that this part should also be really exposed to the students as to how this facility or technical things are being used in day-to-day improved management of the things. So we will certainly get into that. If the management principles and management practices can improve by that, that's a very remarkable learning for each one of us. So I'm thanking you, each one of you, and just to mention all our participants that on 24th of June, we are having another very good webinar that's on e-commerce post-COVID or during COVID. And the panelists there are going to be the founder of Urban Clap, and similarly very senior people from Flipkart, and a tourism industry professional from Singapore who will showcase exact sites at Venice, how they're happening now when everything is happening online. So we will continue to learn from each other, and we'll continue to take this learning forward to all institutions, students, and our friends in the industry. So now, before I thank all the panelists, maybe as Tripti said, in case you want to say one-liners, I'll be very happy about it.
The challenges of 21st century are manifold. Data sharing and information and its use for civil society are on the order of the day. And with the increased need for connectivity, Internet of Things, and reliability of access via small apparatus like a mobile phone, we can facilitate helping education, outreach, health, and for that, space is a key supplier, a key tool. And so my message would be to those out there, if you're interested in interdisciplinary work, with or without space law, you'll need some, but go for it. It's the growth area for the 21st century.
Wow.
And the people interested in it are inspirational.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Sen.
Yes, I would say to your management students, if you're interested in space, I encourage you to look for opportunities in businesses that are related somehow to space. And while you're going through your management studies, read about space, educate yourself about it. There are only 5 treaties, all 5 of which are easily read. The English is quite simple. They're probably translated into other languages. Educate yourself about space, then look for opportunities, because we need good managers. Thank you.
Fantastic, great opportunity. Thank you so very much for opening up this new era, I would say, to all of us. And Rajiv ji, for your final word.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to address students. It's real, the space technology is really the frontier technology. The technology or the space will be useful in the next century or even the days to come. The more you can harness this for your business, you can use that more effectively and cheaply, because this is a resource which the government provides as a government public good, but it can be used by almost any industry.
Yeah.
Wherever you have a large number of people receiving and collecting information, and you are processing it at one place or more than one places, you can use that. And therefore, sky's the limit for this, for people in the management courses. This is an important area that you must know about. Thank you. And
fantastic. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Tripti, for connecting with everybody. And I'm extremely grateful once again to Dr. Jain, Dr. Zain, and Rajiv Khaitan, And thank you very much, all the dear participants, all of you. I'm sure going back home with some learning. We'll keep waiting for your comments, your queries, your suggestions. And to all of us in the field of management and to our college colleagues and professors, certainly you have given us a new subject to think of. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.